had been mayor of Hood River and had been on the city council and always had a kind of a natural interest in politics. And at that time, this area was being represented by a man and wife team from the Dalles. And I thought that it was kind of wrong for the two members of one family to represent the whole district. And I thought the district should be represented by two families. And so I decided to run against his wife, Kitty Musa. Ben Musa was in the Senate. And I won that battle, and 2 years later I announced that I was going to run for the Senate against Ben, and for some reason or other he had thought maybe I might have a chance to beat him too, so he didn't run. And when I ran for the Senate the first time, no Democrat had filed against me, so I had a very easy race of it. My wife was all for it, so I filed, and here I started my career. But I liked it. It fit in pretty well with the business I was in at that time, and I had the time to devote to it. I liked people and thought I was doing a pretty decent job of it, so I kept running, and luckily I kept winning. Let's see, I worked pretty hard on the land use planning bill, Senate Bill 100, which has, I think, done a pretty good job for the state of Oregon. I also sponsored and got passed a bill that would allow districts to be formed across state lines. I had no idea. I was not the primary sponsor on that bill, but I do remember it. And interestingly enough, the corporation Guide Dogs for the Blind out in East Multnomah County had a copy of that bill framed and on the wall when I was there, and they called my attention to the fact that I was one of the sponsors on Guide Dogs. And that made me feel pretty good. Driscoll feels pretty good about it too. And the main sponsor of it thought that it would work a little better if he had Democrats and Republicans, and of course the subject of that bill just makes common sense, and it is kind of nice. And there isn't a fancy hotel or a fancy restaurant or a fancy anything, but what has to admit a guide dog in the United States, and I have been the beneficiary of that situation a time or two too. Agriculture was real big. Transportation was also very big for this area. At one time I represented 7 counties here in this area. All of 6 I think it was, and part of another one. If you're in the metropolitan area, you could walk across your district in maybe a half hour. And it took me 2.5 hours to drive from one corner of my district to the other. It extended from real close to Hermiston, Oregon, and went down within about 50 miles of Eugene. And so if you were a rural legislator, you sure had to do a lot of traveling in the interim, especially when you had an election year. During that interim, there'd been quite a bit of work done on the water districts in the state and the irrigation districts, just cleaning up the bills and putting them in the right place in the ORS and so forth. And when they came back and were presented to the legislature, they went to two separate committees. And it just happened that they hit the floor at the same time. and I was going to be carrying the bill regarding the water district, and somebody else had carried the bill for the irrigation district just prior to the announced that I was going to carry this bill on the water district. And I looked at my notes, and he had given all the points that I was going to give for the water district. So I just said ditto, and everybody kind of looked at me and looked at the bill and saw what I meant, and it passed. So that was a very easy bill to carry, and it's the shortest one in the history of the legislature. Fadley was president of the Senate, and he was having trouble getting a bill through that he was very interested in. And I knew that the body was kind of split on how they felt about this bill. We used to take turns giving the prayer, members of the Senate, and sometimes ministers from that area and so forth. But I had been asked to that morning, and I said, "Dear Lord, help." and that was my prayer. And it kind of made Fadley, who was president of the Senate, a little mad at me, but I thought it was effective prayer for the time. Believe it or not, I was a senior in college at Linfield in a student body meeting. And I had never been up in an airplane. Senior in college. How many people would say that now? One day a fellow got up and made the following motion. He said, "Seeing as how this is supposed to be a Christian institution, I make a motion that the student body go on record as being opposed to the administration placing any form of advertising for the military on the bulletin board." Well, it didn't even come to a vote. We kind of hooted it down. We all knew that that fellow was a communist, and right now he'd probably be a conservative Democrat. But I got wondering what pulled his tail on that subject. So I went to the bulletin board and looked, and it says, "Be a naval aviator." Well, I was a senior. I was getting a degree in business administration. I didn't have any job lined up, and I started looking at the qualifications that were necessary to enter the Navy pilot program at that time, and I thought I fitted in pretty well as far as height and weight and college degree and so forth. If I'd only had 2 years of college, subjects would have to been in chemistry and physics and things like that, which I did not have. But anyway, I talked to my roommate about it, and he kind of got interested too, and the two of us applied, and lo and behold, both of us made it. We each got our Navy wings because of he was in the Navy and I ended up in the Marine Air Corps. I believe it was in about June of 1941. They were recruiting for an outfit called the American Volunteer Group out in China, and I thought about it quite a bit, and I had made up my mind I didn't want to have a military career, and I thought, and I hadn't traveled very much, and 2 or 3 of us, good friends in that same squadron, I think 3 guys will do something that 1 wouldn't do, and we started talking and said, well, let's look into that. My pay jumped about, they offered me 3 times as much pay as I was making for a second lieutenant. The fact I'd get to travel quite a bit, the fact that I could end my military duties, formal military duties anyway, and go into test flying or other things when I came back if I wanted to. And I actually did have a kind of, I felt very sorry for the Chinese at that time because they were really taking a beating, and I also thought maybe I could do a little good for the Chinese people. So there was quite a few reasons, and three guys talking themselves into it was probably, and very, very good friends. And we all ended up in the same fighter squadron out in China. And one fella didn't go. There were four of us started in. And that one fella backed out because he was the son of a widowed lady, only son, and oddly enough, he was killed in a routine cross-country flight while the three of us were waiting to take the ship out to China, and the three of us that went out there all came back. Yes, we were outnumbered. Sometimes we might have 12 airplanes taking on 100 of them. And our main object would be the bombers, so there was no doubt about that. We had a plane in the P-40 that had an advantage though, and we had orders from General Chennault to live to fly another day because, in other words, don't take too many chances, but because we need the airplane and we need you. But the fact that we could outdive the Japanese fighters was a big advantage. If you start dogfighting with him, and if he starts to get on your tail, all we had to do was put the nose of that P-40 down and we could dive out, and he couldn't stay with us. So we had that advantage. We also had more firepower in the P-40 than the Japanese fighters had in their airplanes. Most of our actual targets, though, were the bombers. The Japanese were good pilots and flew good formation, but if you pick away at them, you get pretty good results, especially when you could call the shot as far as whether you're going to continue the fight or not. But it was a wonderful experience as it worked out. We made a pretty good name for ourselves while we were there. Madame Chiang Kai-shek came to this country while I was testing at Republic. And there were about, I would say, 8 or 10 of the AVG pilots working on Long Island, either at Grumman Aviation, where they were building Navy planes, or Republic, or Pan Am offices were there. There were a couple of Pratt & Whitney, had some AVG pilots there. But anyway, she spoke from Madison Square Garden over national radio. And somebody got the idea that they should have some of us come in and be her guard of honor when she walked onto the stage. Well, so we were there that night, and there were 8 governors there from the East Coast. Wendell Willkie was there, the British ambassador was there, and we were standing around in the group, and Hap Arnold, who was then commanding general of the United States Air Corps, came up and saw us. And we had our uniforms on that we had used out in China, and a good percentage of the group had been Army, but he recognized the uniforms, and he came up, and I was outside the circle, and he started talking to me, and he says, "Say, young man, when am I going to get you fellas back?" And I kind of grinned, and I said, "Well, in the first place, General, you didn't have me, and in the second place, you're not going to get me." And he gave me a quick look and said, "Well, what are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm an experimental test pilot on the P-47 out of Republic." And he patted me on the back and said, "You're doing your part." And then he started visiting with me a little bit, and he said, "You fellas should be proud of your record out there. You did a good job. But I hope you understand that your main contribution to your country wasn't the number of airplanes that you happened to shoot down, and you did a good job there, but you carried the morale of your country for 6 months, because here was a small group of American pilots flying American-made airplanes, putting on a good show, and it was the only place for 6 months that there was anything good coming. It took us 6 or 8 months to get going. And you carried the morale of your country for that time. And he said, that, young man, was your main contribution. It wasn't the fact that you shot down a lot of airplanes. Well, as I said, I was a test pilot at Republic, and Grumman Aviation, which was the manufacturer of many airplanes like the Wildcat and the Hellcat and so forth, we traded flights once in a while. They were interested in our opinions of their airplanes, so they'd invite us to come over and fly anything new that they developed. And I had flown the Wildcat while I was in the Marines. And here's a little offshoot of that. I checked out in 2 different airplanes on 2 different carriers and had a grand total of 17 carrier landings before I left the Marines. And when the Hellcat came out, they were interested in what we thought of it, and I was down in the John and washing my hands, and I looked up and was conscious of a tall fellow standing beside me, and I looked up and it was Lindbergh. And he quickly said to me, "Say, would you tell me what kind of insignia that is on your flight jacket? I don't recognize it." And I said, well, I had been with the Flying Tigers out in China and Burma, and that's the insignia for the 3rd Squadron, the Hell's Angel. And he says, "Hey, that was a pretty famous outfit." And just then the fellow I'd gone over there with to fly the Hellcat burst into the John, and he says, "Hey, Journey, well, Lindy's around here someplace." And I said, "Yeah, right here." Looked up at him, and he was kind of a short guy, and he stuck out his hand and shook it, and Lindbergh grinned, and pretty soon he said, "Have you fellows had a chance to look at a Corsair?" And we both hadn't and said so. And so he said, "Well, come out." And he says, I'll show you the one I flew in here." And of course that was, we were interested in anything different. And so we went out and we had about a 20-minute dissertation from him on the features of the Corsair, which was a good Navy fighter. And pretty soon they announced that the plane that we were ready to fly was ready. I was scheduled to fly it first, but I knew Lindbergh wanted to get out of there, and so I started insisting that he fly it first. I said to him, "Look, Lindy, when I get through here, all I have to do is drive about 10 miles and go home. My day's work's going to be through. You flew in here. I know you're going to fly out someplace, and it would seem to me that you'd like to get going." He said, "Well, to tell you the truth, I would." And okay, I said, "Fly it." And so he got in that Hellcat, and when he got ready to land about a half hour later, he couldn't get the gear down. And after, I tell you, every engineer in that Grumman factory was out there, because he hears Lindbergh in one of their airplanes and the gear wasn't coming down. So finally, after 3 dives and a quick pull-out, he flipped the gear down and he landed it. And I had the nerve to come up to him, and I said to him, "Thanks for checking that thing out for me, Lindy." And he laughed, and about a month later he came to Republic to look at our latest P-47. He recognized me, and we had another visit. So I always kind of like to tell that tale, because I consider him to be one of the greatest pilots of all time. Pilots got the Distinguished Flying Cross, and all the crew members, the prop men and the mechanics and the radio men and so forth, received the Bronze Star. We only got one, but it felt pretty good. But here again, it's kind of interesting. I'll bet you that I'm the only man in the history of the world, and probably will be, that received the DFC over 50 years after the fact with a guide dog. Well, I think sooner or later they will have to go to yearly sessions. I think that's down the line. Remember who Al Ullman was? He was a representative from this area, lived out near Baker or someplace, and he was representative for quite a while to Washington, D.C. But I remember going back to Washington, D.C. one time when I was back there on some Coca-Cola thing or Soft Drink Ballers Association thing or anything, and we were supposed to look up invite our representatives to a social function that evening, and I contacted Ullman, and sure enough he came. Well, it was right kind of at the beginning of my senatorial career, and we hadn't met each other before, and we kind of went to one side and started getting acquainted, and pretty soon Al Ullman said to me, what are you guys going to do about Oregon's tax situation? And I kind of grinned. I said, well, I don't know just what we can do. I know that a few of us Republicans think we ought to have a sales tax to take some of the load off the property tax. And Al Ullman quickly said, Oregon has to come to a sales tax. And I looked at him, I said, I can quote you on that, can I, Congressman? And he grinned and he says, if you do, I'll deny I ever said it. But I think that any state that uses all three forms of taxation, property, sales, and income tax, and it's, of course, you can have out of balance in that, but even if you have all three, you're better off than having two or one, and it spreads the load properly. And I think that I still think that Oregon needs a sales tax, general sales tax. What I'm about to say would maybe answer some of the things that are wrong down there right now, because if I were starting out all over again, I would be interested in, and I was interested in city government, school boards, and so forth, and county government, run for those offices and see whether you like it or not, and see if you do a good job. But start out in the local areas before you start running for the legislature. Now, I'm not saying that a person couldn't do a good job, and there are good legislators that never had any experience in local government, but you find yourself representing a lot of cities. I can't remember, I think I had 38 city councils that I had to answer to as a member of the Senate, and Lord knows how many school districts and so forth. But if you've had a little experience before you get there, you understand those problems a little better. Well, one thing I'd like to say that my wife Jen, whom you met, I probably would never have run for the legislature if it hadn't been for her. She got behind me and worked on my campaigns and did a lot of footwork. And of course, we were both quite a bit younger in those days, and she was my secretary for several sessions. She had the training to be a secretary, so that fit in pretty well. And I owe a lot of my political success to Jen Jernsted. And I haven't told her that often enough, I'm sure, but I'd like to make note of it, because she has been a very, very helpful person.